It's time to wire up more of our epic automation. We're in the thick of it now. Over the course of the 3 previous labs, we've learned some new technology, like stack sets, and expanded our use of EventBridge with multiple event buses. Plus, we've managed all the cross-account centralization and permissions. This week, I want to talk a bit about architecture and efficiency. And the pattern we're building out is used for a lot more than security, and it's one of the many common event-driven architectural approaches. Now, there's a few criteria that have led us down this particular path, and you can actually see a little sample of it on the whiteboard, and I'm going to talk about that more a little bit later. We are automating only within AWS and using AWS native events. And this is a big driver towards using EventBridge to centralize the events that we want and use EventBridge rules for triggering and filtering all the automations that we're going to put in place. Now, only forwarding the events we want keeps cost and workload down. So in our case, that's why we selected the very specific Amazon S3 events that we wanted to use for our automation, and we can expand this over time. We want to run our security tooling centrally, but manage distributed accounts. And so this also pushed us into centralizing our event buses, but to build out our actual application in a central account instead of distributing the application components. And in our case, it'll be Lambda functions. For example, we could have pushed serverless functions into every account and run all that automation locally. But in our case, it makes more sense to run them in our security operations account and have them make changes to the target account from centrally. This allows us to have that central management and that central security control. Another really big factor here is my personal experience and my comfort level with this architecture. I released my very first Autoremediation the weekend after EventBridge rules was actually released, and it was actually called CloudWatch rules at the time. They changed the name on us. The architecture I use for that is very similar to what we're building out, and this architecture is very similar to the core of a product we've been building at work called Firemon Cloud Defense, which is a commercial platform that we started working on about 7-8 years ago. So I know this works, and I know this scales up to thousands of AWS accounts and tens or hundreds of thousands of resources. Now, unlike our architecture, those Cloud Defense customers send like every CloudTrail across, and it uses Security Hub and a bunch of other things, and we do all the filtering on our side. And that's because that tool is meant to cover a broader range of things. What I'm showing you how to do is a little bit more focused and a little bit more consolidated for the use of like what you might implement in your own organization on top of any commercial product you might have. So this is why we used EventBridge. This is why we centralized and filtered things the way that we wanted. Our next step is going to be to process those events to enforce our auto-remediation guardrails. Remember, we're doing all of this to make up for those little holes in the resource control policies around S3 tagging. And we're going to be using serverless functions for those guardrails. Now, I spoiled that in an earlier talk, and we're going to be using Lambda. Lambda is, again, those functions as a service or serverless functions. And we're going to talk a lot more about them when we actually get to implementing Lambda. We're going to do that over the course of a few labs. But just know that at the core, a Lambda function is code that you write that runs within AWS, but only when something triggers it. We don't need to maintain a container or a server. You just upload your code into AWS and run it, and it will run based on whatever triggers that we set. In our case, we're going to learn how to trigger a Lambda function using an EventBridge rule, and we're also going to be able to do it at a scheduled time, similar to a cron drop. That allows us to do our sweeps, and it allows us to also do our real-time event-driven response. You can also trigger from other Lambda functions, API gateways, all sorts of stuff. All right. So we know we're going to use EventBridge, and we know we're going to use Lambda functions, and we know we've got things set up cross-account. The next decision is, how do we want to structure our Lambda functions themselves? Because that's going to affect how we build our EventBridge rule to trigger them. And what do I mean by that? Well, we could, for example, have one big Lambda function that has all of the auto remediations across any services, right? Remember, we're just doing S3 for now, but someday we're probably going to add more automation for more services. Number two is we could have some smaller functions for every single automation. That was actually an architecture we evaluated early on over on that commercial side over at Firemont, where we were looking at having like a Lambda function for every assessment and every remediation. And that's a viable option. Or you could have one function per service. So like one function with all the analysis and remediations for S3 and another for all the analysis and remediations of EC2. Every one of these options is viable. Now, I've personally learned to generally avoid a lot of those smaller functions because it just is harder to manage. There's also some nuances to Lambda functions, things we're not going to totally get into, but it has to do with how long it takes the Lambda function to start up, which is cold versus warm starts, which at our scale isn't going to matter, but when you scale much larger is going to be a factor. So if we take that many small functions out, which is that option 2, that gives us options 1 or 3, one big one or per service ones. And I decided to go with option 3, which is where we're going to build a function on a service basis. We're going to build one function with all of our S3 stuff, and later if we do EC2, we're going to build another function with all of our EC2 stuff. And the reasoning for that is it means each function needs fewer IAM privileges, which is nice. I mean, these things are going to be making changes in our accounts, and so that allows us to scope them just for the servers that they're operating on. And I like that kind of like least privilege compartmentalization stuff because I'm a security nerd and that's how I think of things. The next is also that we're doing learning labs, and this allows us to compartmentalize around each service. It's going to make it easier for me to teach you stuff. So all the S3 code will be in one place, and it's not going to be commingled with other services. It makes it a lot easier, a lot more compartmentalized for us to read it and to discuss it and to implement. Another thing is that once functions hit a certain size, you can't just upload them in the console, which is how we're going to do that. You're going to copy paste in future labs. You would actually have to load them as a zip file instead of pasting them in the console, and you can't read the function in that zip file after it's loaded up. I want you to be able to see everything. I want you to have a very visual experience. We're doing everything in the console right now. And even though in the real world, you'd be doing a lot of this with more infrastructure as code, for learning purposes, it's just, I think, better for us to be able to actually see it all in the AWS console. Now, one last point. We also need to decide if we want our assessment and our remediation code in the same function. So you would actually do the assessment and then you could remediate. And you can break these things out, but for simplicity and clarity, we're going to keep those consolidated. And in my experience, it often is a lot easier to keep those consolidated. All right. Hopefully this gives you an idea of why I built these labs this way. Even experienced pros don't always get things correct on the first shot, and there's a lot of different approaches to solving one problem. We've completely rebuilt the architecture of Cloud Defense multiple times as our needs have changed and our customers' needs have changed, and as Amazon features have changed. So you kind of get used to these iterative cycles and constantly reevaluating your approach and your architectures. And now, what's great about cloud is we can run multiple stacks simultaneously. At one point, we were running like two or three completely different versions of the platform all in the same place, and it was invisible to customers. So it's great. You can make all these updates constantly, and you can do it without really any significant downtime or visible impact to users, especially if you're very event-driven and serverless the way that we're doing things here. With that, let's get into the lab. Before we get into the meat of the lab, I want to do a real quick review over what we're going to build. We took a look at this briefly during the lecture portion, but let's take another look real quick. And what we're setting up today is that we have our security operations account, and then we have our production account over here. It's in our production OU, and we called it production 1. What we have already built out is that we have that forwarder rule that's in place, and we have all of the IAM permissions associated with that forwarder rule, which is going to allow those messages to be sent all the way over to our event bus. And that is all wired up properly as far as I know right now. Now, what we don't have that we need to add is the rule to trigger on S3. Remember, we are going to be able to expand this to other services over time, but we're going to have one rule just for S3 events, and that's going to send to our S3 serverless functions once we implement those. But instead of sending it to the Lambda functions, because we haven't built that yet, we're going to test everything, and we're going to do that testing using simple notification service, and we're just going to send ourselves an email. So we need to create an SNS for alerts in our security operations account because we haven't done that yet. Now, why are we using SNS? Why aren't we just building the Lambda functions or something else? Remember, these labs are designed to teach you things iteratively. This is also to help with testing. In fact, I spent hours extra on this lab because I had part of it wrong. So the actual rule that I had for triggering on S3, I was struggling to get that tuned properly. So even though I've done this a lot, that was a rule that was different than the ones I've written before. And so I ran into a little bit of trouble. So we're going to use this as our testing mechanism to make sure everything is wired together properly before we start worrying about code. We want to simplify things down and really be able to make sure that we can more cleanly identify any points of failure as we're building this up over time. So that's why we're going to use simple notification service. It also works well because you're familiar with it. Another option would have been to go to CloudWatch logs. That's what I would use if I was doing this in a collaborative development environment, because then everybody could see the results instead of like popping out an email. That's the better way to do things. But for our lab purposes, I'm keeping it familiar. I don't want to introduce another service at this point in time. We want to work with the ones that we're already familiar with. And it only takes a couple of minutes to set it up. Okay, so with that, let's start on the lab. So the steps we're going to go through are, we're going to go into our security operations account, and we're going to set up the rule that we need, and we're going to put that in place so that that's going to send to SNS. We also need to set up SNS because we have to have that target in place first. Then we're going to jump over into that production 1 account. Now, one of the little hiccups is we never set that up in IAM Identity Center, so it's not going to show up on your sign-in list. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to jump into our management account, and we're going to use that organization access role to pop us into that production 1 account. And because it's faster than me having to walk you through another IAM Identity Center setup. So not a big deal. It's going to go pretty quick. With all of that, let's actually start in on the process. And we want to start with our sign-in portal. And we want to go to Security Operations and Administrator Access. And if you see my mouse jumping a little bit, it's just because there's a lot going on in this one, so I want to make sure I get my step-by-step correctly. From here, the first thing we need to do, so we should be, again, in our security operations account. I just happen to know that that's my account ID. It'd be nice if they put those names on here. Hey, Amazon, I know some of you actually are watching these. Actually, you're probably just reading the blog post. And we want to go to Simple Notification Service so we can set up our SNS. So we'll go to SNS. Go over to Simple Notification Service. Now, in my diagram, I called it Security Alerts, but let's call this Security Testing. And I'll fix that in the diagram after the fact. And we'll go to Next Step for our topic. And we'll just stick with the basics. We do not need anything else, just a dumb old standard topic, the most fundamental thing that we've got. Now, as always, we need to subscribe. So we'll go to Create Subscription. And you guessed it, we're going to do email like we've done previously and pop in your email. I'll just use my regular old email. That's definitely public. There's no hiding that one. And click Create Subscription. Now, this is going to send the email to my inbox. So I'm going to go ahead and pause, flip over to my inbox, and click that link. That comes over pretty quick. I clicked it and I'm all subscribed, so I'll get emails on this notification topic. Okay, with the topic set up, let's build our event bridge rule. Now here's a reminder. What we're doing is we're in our security operations account. This is our central event bridge rule that we're going to use to trigger our actual auto remediations. So the rule or the events are being sent from that production 1 account. To get there, we'll go into Event Bridge. And this is the rule that I messed up to the point of where I had to actually go cheat and look at how we implemented it over at the on the Firemon side and then make adjustments to the rules there. Within here, so if you recall, I'm going to start by going to Event Buses just as a reminder, and we have our Security Automation Event Bus. So this is the one where we're sending things over to. Well, we want to go to Rules. So let's go to Rules. And we're going to you have to select your event bus. So we're not using the default. Remember, that's where everything in this account goes to. The security automation one is the little private one we set up for our security automations. And we don't have any rules here. So create rule. And the rule name that we're going to use, I didn't think about this. Let's go with S3 Security Remediations. So S3 Security Remediations, and we'll say auto remediations, including auto remediations for the S3 service. And the event bus we're tied to is that security automation event bus. And we do want rule with an event pattern. Click next. Now, we want AWS events or Event Bridge partner events because that's all built in. And we don't want to use the pattern form. We want to use a custom pattern with the JSON editor because I'm going to have you copy paste because we do need a very specific one. And I'm going to pause real quick. I'm going to go grab that from the blog post, and that's what you're going to do. Copy and paste from the blog post. And here it is. So the rule itself is very simple. So the detail type it's looking for, it's basically, this is going to match any part of an event that comes across, where it's an AWS API call from CloudTrail, because that is all we're sending over. And then the event source is the S3 service. So this is only going to work for events from S3. Now, why am I not limiting it to the very specific events that we did in the previous labs that we pushed out? Remember, we're only looking for 4 or 5 or 6 events. I can't remember what the count is. That's because I don't need to do that because right on the receiving side of this, I'm only receiving those events that I've designated. And we may expand that over time. I don't have to make changes on both sides. I am totally okay with this taking any S3 event and then using that and sending that over to the Lambda function for processing, because the Lambda function is only going to look for specific things anyway. All right. So this is looking for those S3 events, and we're going to click next. Then the target. So the target type is going to be, and we want SNS. So I'm going to go to SNS topic, and the target is in this account, and it's going to be our security testing SNS topic. And we're going to go ahead and click next. No tags associated with this, click next. Review and create, scroll down, click create rule. Now, remember something. We have this event bus in multiple regions. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to flip over to another region, and I'm going to implement the same thing in US East. It's really quick to go ahead and do this. Now, I am not going to do the testing in US East. I'm going to just keep my testing into US West Oregon just for time's sake. But when we go ahead and we actually implement the full Lambda function, we're going to do that in both regions. I'm going to go to the top here for regions. Let's go with North Virginia. Oh, you know what? I'm not going to implement it this week. Let me go back to Oregon. Ignore what I said because I would have to have a target. We don't have our target yet. So we'll double up and we'll do that implementation next week. And I'll remind everybody that in the blog post that we're going to have to implement this in both regions. So we're in our US West Oregon. We're just going to test the basic wiring. We're only testing it in this one region for right now. This is all set. And I have my rule in place. And if I click on rules, you'll notice there's nothing here. But if I click on the rule that says security automation, then my S3 security remediations rule is going to appear there. Okay. The next thing we need to do is go close this window. And now we're going to pivot into our test account in our production 1 account where we've set everything else up. So to do this, let's go into S.L.A.W and administrator access. We're going to go into our management account because I need to get that account ID from AWS organizations. And then I need to use that account ID to do an assume role operation, a switch role. And it's really easy. So I'm in my main account and my management account, and I'm going to go to AWS organizations. And I'm going to go down to workloads, and we're going to go to production. Remember, we have non-prod accounts, but we implemented this in production only, not in non-prod. And I need that account ID. So let me copy that account ID. So that's my production 1 account ID. Now, right from the screen, I just go up to the right side, click up there. Now, you can see I'd already done this, but I'm going to do it again. I'm going to go switch role. It keeps your role history for a while. and I paste in that account ID. And then the IAM role name I'm going to give is organization account. And you see my thing's already trying to fill it in. Access role. That's that powerful role that only works from our management account, which is why we have it set up. And then the display name I'm going to use, I like to put the account ID of the account that I'm using. And the display color, you can do whatever you want. Because I already had this in there once, I'm going to put it in again. I'm going to just make it orange. I don't really care what you do. And switch role. Now you can see that I'm in that account, which is my production 1 account. And it shows me, if I click on that arrow, it'll actually tell you this is in my role history. It's where I am. And it shows that I'm currently active as the organization account access role and that was my account ID for production 1. Okay, so let me double check my to-do list. I think we are just going to go straight into, actually we are just going to go straight into S3. And we need a bucket. So we don't have any buckets here. Now this is really important. Remember, we wired everything up in Oregon. And S3 dumped us straight to North Virginia. So I need to switch over to the Oregon region for our testing to make sure that this works properly. Now that I'm in Oregon, I'm going to go ahead and go create bucket. And the bucket we want is just a general purpose bucket. And let's go, I'm going to call our mogul-prod1-slaw-test, blah, blah. So remember, these have to be globally unique. This is never going to be public or anything else. This is just lets us know it's a testing bucket. And we leave all of the defaults here. Now, the one thing we want to do is add tags. And because that's how we're defining some of this. And for right now, for our testing purposes, we're just going to add any old tag. I like just mashing my keyboard, ASDF. ASDF works pretty well for the tag that we need today. And we're going to go ahead and hit create bucket. Now, what's interesting is because that create bucket command was issued, I don't think create bucket is one of the ones that we are alerting on because we only cared if a bucket was tagged a particular way. You don't need to do this, but I'm just going to show you that if I go into CloudTrail and go into my event history here, should be able to see it hasn't come through yet. That's stuff I was doing yesterday. Let's hit a refresh here. But when the time comes, the bucket will show up here as create bucket events. So let's go back over to S3. It would have been nicer if that actually popped up right away and I could show you. But we have that bucket and we have our properties. And as part of our properties, we should have, our tags on here. Yep. All right, so I'm going to go pause, and I'm going to wait for the email to see if I get my alert. And this is what I get. It's that really ugly JSON, and all I care about, it actually came through. I was nervous it didn't work. I'm like, oh my God, I didn't hear my email go off. And that was because I'm recording a video, so I had my alerts turned off. So we got the alert. Everything worked great. And let me, instead of switching over to my face and describing it, let me go back over to the view here. So as a reminder, what we did is we built this rule that triggers on S3 events that is sending, and it's, let's just go ahead and fix that. We'll call it security testing, which is what we set it up as. And when that triggers, it sends that to that SNS topic, which sends to our email. So we made a change all the way over here in our production 1 account, which is any production account in our production OU, because the stack set pushed all of that code down in there, made those the event bridge rules and wired things up the way that we wanted. And then that little forwarder rule forwards those events to our centralized event bus that triggered on any S3 event, and then that sent us the message. It's pretty simple, or at least when you lay it out like this. Trust me, it took a while to figure out and to test this architecture and to get all of the rules correct and to make sure that that everything was wired up properly. But once you get this pattern down, it's not hard to implement it. The biggest thing that you need to watch out for is how you set up those rules to forward your things around and make sure you get the right events and the right structures. That's what messed me up a little bit, but I did eventually get it get it down so it worked properly. And then you get those reusable patterns. Well, that's it for this week. We know all of our wiring works. Our centralized event bus works. We're getting the events that we want. We're able to forward those around, and we'll be able to send those off to our Lambda functions, which is the next pieces that we're going to start building out as part of this epic cloud security automation, what I call it, advanced cloud security problem solving track that we're working on. Thanks. Have a great week.